Dan, our next guest is Ken Cooper, founder of CooperCom. I like the name. He's here to talk about harassment in the workplace and Cooper's 8 offender stereotypes. It's a tool which divides harassment into 2 parts, studs and sneaks. Ken, I absolutely love that, and I really look forward to hearing more about it. But first, tell us a little bit about yourself, about your company, and how you came to be so knowledgeable in this area. And welcome to the program.
Well, thanks for having me on. My background, I'm a stand-up corporate trainer. So I put on seminars, training seminars for businesses, and have been doing so for a very long time. And I was, decades ago, I was back doing assertion training seminars. And back when soft skills were very important for businesses. And the audience I had at a large company was doing the non-exempts, and they're all primarily women, and they would bring up these situations. And so the discussion of harassment became kind of an eagerly looked forward to part of the seminar. And over time, we started to develop patterns, and I ended up writing a book on it called Stop It Now, How Targets and Managers Can End Sexual Harassment. And I also have a book on body language, so those two were very closely meshed. And I began to categorize what I heard and started training people on the soft skills, the behavioral skills around sexual harassment. So that's how it all began. Hundreds of seminars and tens of thousands of attendees later, the techniques have been pretty much validated.
Well, I'm going to ask you, our newspapers and media are being overwhelmed with all of these harassment stories. Our politicians are being driven from office. But is it more frequent today, or is it just being publicized more today?
Well, in my estimation, there's no change. It's not an epidemic that suddenly popped up. It's just never gone away. I mean, if you think back to the late 80s with the Clarence Thomas case, remember with Anita Hill? If you think of Wilbur Mills and the title bombshell situation, you think of a couple of presidential candidates that were caught doing things they shouldn't and had to drop out. I mean, what's been going on and what's been publicized, it's been around forever. So it's just that people are more willing to speak up about it, even though the regulations and laws have been in place since 1981.
Well, a question is, and here I'm going to get into dangerous territory, but what the heck? But, we hear harassment, but I had a police chief in East Orange many years ago say that much of harassment was breach of promise, and that a lot of things that happened were involved really that the expectation on one side or another, on both sides for that matter, were different, and that at the end, when things had ended badly, you had these various cases. Is that invalid or invalid statement, or can you expand on it?
Sure. What we're really talking about, I think, are 2 different things. So official sexual harassment, the kind that's forbidden under the Civil Rights Act and Title VII, is a workplace situation. So there's a big difference today in some of the stories we hear of what I call men behaving badly versus workplace sexual harassment. So if a comedian invites a woman up to his room and expects sex to take place and the woman wants a relationship, as happened to a famous stand-up comedian, that's men behaving badly. And that's a disconnect in terms of what they expected. But in a harassment situation at work, it's some sort of coercive relationship that has a negative effect on the target. So that's a little bit different than perhaps what the police chief was talking about. In the police environment, it would be, there was a case, for example, where the officers would go, all the interrogation rooms had TV, and if someone was going to be searched, a woman was going to be searched, they'd all run over to the TV and watch and make comments. Well, that found its way into the courts and was found to be harassment because it was workplace harassment, different, let's say, than a criminal situation that somebody might have run into. Does that help separate the 2?
I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to turn it over to Dan. To me, this is a fascinating subject.
Well, I agree. It's a fascinating subject. And Ken, thank you for joining us today. I'd like to start off my session with playing perhaps devil's advocate with you.
Okay.
I'm going to respectfully disagree with your premise that it hasn't changed much. And the reason I'm going to disagree with you is that I think that there is one thing that has changed dramatically over the last, let's say, 4 to 6 decades, and that is the deterioration of the moral compass of what is acceptable behavior sexually. The increasing number of people who are living together, not married, the amount of sexual activity. I was at a conference yesterday morning where the woman was talking about sexual activity in the United States, and that 15 years ago there were 5 sexually transmitted diseases. Now there are 50 strains, and strangely enough, she said about 45 of them more adversely affect women than men. And so that we have a society where sex has become very open, very public, whether it's in television or on the movie screens or in the music. And so that whole structure of what is appropriate behavior in many different facets of our life has deteriorated. So I do think there have been some very significant changes in our society that may have also be reflective in what happens between the hormones between men and women. And I'd like to have your thoughts on that.
Well, certainly society has changed, and certainly what's acceptable in public and acceptable in the movies, acceptable on TV, acceptable socially in terms of relationships is very different. There's no question about that. But, I always like to use the example of the presidents. And people talk about, well, men have been behaving badly lately. Well, if you go back through the various presidents, you can start with Roosevelt, and he had his mistresses. Then you go to Eisenhower, he had his driver, Kay Summersby. You work your way up through President Kennedy, was a renown as a womanizer. Work your way on up, Johnson, and so on, all the way up into more modern times. If anything, maybe it's been less. You can probably go through history, and men behaving badly primarily, has been around a long time. So I think this idea of one person exhibiting power over the other, which is what harassment is, I think that's been around forever in one shape or another. If anything, I think it's the ascendance of women in the workplace that have made it come out more, because women are now in more positions of authority, find themselves into jobs they weren't in those past decades, and therefore it's taken a while for society to adjust to the fact that, hey folks, the women are in the workplace, they're here to stay, and why can't we just treat everybody equally, and why does there have to be this power game going on? It really doesn't have a place in the workplace. So my feeling is, actually, in the decades that I've been at work at it, I haven't seen any difference.
Okay. So if we look at what's going on today, I'm curious, when there is a movement, social, political, whatever it is, in our country, back in speaking of history, we can usually go back to a particular person or an event that changed the paradigm. Is there a seminal event that you think changed in the last year or two that changed the whole public persona of what's going on between men and women?
I think that targets, and I don't like to use the word victim, so I tend to use the word offender and targets, because the target could be a man or a woman. I think targets are more open now to speak out. And so one of the characteristics of a harassment situation that's been fascinating with all these public stories is when an incident comes out, somebody finally comes forward and says, you know what, so-and-so has been harassing me. Invariably, other targets come out of the woodwork. And you see lots of people saying, me too, me too, me too. And so that's where that came from. But it's true. When you investigate one of these in a business, you find almost no problem validating what happened, because it's happened to a lot of people. And the reason is, for the offender, it's a pattern of behavior. It's not how they treat one person. It's how they treat everybody. It's how they treat all women. And therefore, when one person comes forward, the rest suddenly say, you know what, we've all been treated that way by this person. And you can verify it just by the sheer numbers. And so in almost every single case, we've seen exactly that pattern happen. And that's, I think, part of what's happening, too. People are just more willing to finally come forward with the feeling that, you know what, something's really going to be done this time about it.
Dan, I'd like to jump in here on two things. You say things are expected to be done. I've been a reporter for a long time, and I've gone through, ironically, you even mentioned Wilbur Mills, and there aren't too many people that remember him and Fannie Flagg. But in all these cases, we've had these events appear, and then the media gets tired of covering it, or the public gets tired, and we go back to the same old thing. Do you think that's going to happen here today?
I think perhaps we've hit a milestone in terms of what is acceptable and not acceptable behavior, not only in public but in business. I think everybody's on notice at this point that there can be severe ramifications. And again, we're dealing many times with just things that have been publicized, but for example, the Steve Wynn situation, that indeed what you do can have profound effects on you no matter how high you are in the organization. And that's something that hasn't been true in the past. At a certain level in the executive suite and above, you could pay somebody to go away, and then that was that. And so that's not working anymore.
Well, in the New York Times Sunday section, this was a major story about Mary Cunningham AG and her relationship with the chairman of Bendix Corp. If the audience doesn't know, it was probably one of the first cases of Paramore being advanced by a powerful corporate leader that really became widely known. And she said in the piece that she's suffering repercussions from it even today. I just wondered your thoughts on that.
Well, one of the questions that always comes up when you talk about sexual harassment is people say, well, what about women harassing men, or what about reverse harassment, or what about that going on? So that's one issue here, and the other issue is the idea of consensual relationships in business. So we'll do those one at a time. So the first thing is there's 4 scenarios that can happen in harassment. It can be male harassment of a female, which is by and large the vast majority of cases. A lot of people say, what about female harassment of males? Well, it turns out that's less than 1% in the studies. About 0.6% of the cases are reverse harassment, where a female harasses a male. Second most likely to happen is male harassment of another male. So male same-sex harassment of a male, that's second. Third is female same-sex harassment of another female. And fourth, if ever, is female harassment of male. So a lot of people are very surprised at that while people like to ask about it, it's not really the issue. It's actually male harassment of either male or females is the vast majority of all cases you'll see. So that's one thing. Second thing is the idea of, well, what about a consensual relationship? A lot of marriages start for people having met at work. So the EEOC has no restrictions legally on consensual relationships at work. What they do suggest is if you're in the same reporting chain, there's an implied conflict of interest. So it's up to you to notify your boss or your management, hey, someone who reports to me, we now have a personal relationship, and try to remove that conflict of interest. So those are the kind of things that, while they're not legal, are often written into a company's policy that says, look, if you're going to date a subordinate, you just got to let us know so we can remove the coercive nature of it should you break up, and then you still are working with each other, boss to subordinate. So I think a little bit of both of those things was happening in the situation you just mentioned.
Well, I'm going to one more question, turn it back to Dan, which is since this program aims at small business, what are there differences in small businesses that you've seen, or um, uh, anything that a small business leader should look at? Can you can you kind of focus a little bit on small business?
Absolutely. In fact, I owned a company for 10 years, an online training company. We had 26 employees, and all but 4 were women. So we both trained on it, and we understood what the situation was. So just legally, if you have over 15 employees, you're subject to the federal guidelines. So even a small business has the same rules as does the giant multinational in terms of the legalities. So you need to have a policy in place. It needs to be part of your policy manual. You need the notice up on the wall. Everybody has to be informed as to what the complaint procedure is. Any complaint has to be investigated with what's called a best practice approach, meaning you've got to do it as good as you can. And depending on where you are geographically, for example, California has some additional rules and things you have to do in terms of contact time of training, and also the discussion of bullying and so on. So you based on where you are as a small business, talk to your legal advisor, talk to your labor advisor. You have the same kinds of responsibilities a large business does.
Dan, back to you.
I want to go back to the blurb that they sent us, where you you talk about 8 offender stereotype tools, which divide harassment into 2 overreaching categories: studs and sneaks. Can you talk about studs and sneaks?
Absolutely. So where this came from is the targets of harassment in our seminars early on were having trouble describing what happened to them and conveying that to management. So they might go to their supervisor and say, look, Bob puts his hands all over me. I'm just tired of it. Make him stop. And the manager would typically say something like, listen, Bob's just friendly. He doesn't mean anything by it. Come on, don't be so sensitive, and send the target on their way. So what we found is we needed to do 2 things. We needed one, culturally in an organization, you've got to establish that harassers are losers. Somebody who sexually harasses a woman is a loser. And by that I mean, just take a bar. You walk up to a woman in a bar and say, can I buy you a drink? Or you ask a coworker out, hey, would you like to have dinner some night? And the coworker says no. All right. So the average person says, okay. The average man says, all right, I asked, no, move on. There's 3.7 billion women in the world. Somebody out there is going to like me. I'll just find somebody who likes me, instead of pushing myself on someone who doesn't want to be with me. So the idea that you're pushing yourself on someone who doesn't want to be with you or date you or whatever is loser behavior. So you need to establish that. So what we did is we set up and we began to hear patterns, and we gave them very insulting names, like the Neanderthal or the God's gift to women, so that now a target could go up and say, listen, Bob's a God's gift to women, and then we added that there's 6 levels of harassment. He's giving me level 3 harassment. Now that's a language that means something. Everybody's been through the training. They know exactly what that is. It's called pinpointing the behavior, and so now you can describe what's going on. So there were really 2 types. The studs were the folks that thought they were cool and weren't, and the sneaks were the ones that came at you like they were nice. And it turned out that they were really no different than the studs. For example, a false mentor. You go to somebody and you think, oh, here's somebody who's helping me with my career. And the answer is no, they're just trying to get you in bed just like everybody else. So with some of the famous cases, that's been the case, where people would go to these well-established executives or stars thinking that they were going to receive help, only to find out that they were just trying to get them in bed.
The question that we've had a number of people on our program on variations of this particular theme, and a question I asked them is that a recent study that I saw shows that, as crazy as it sounds, more and more men are turning to robots for relationships. And I'm wondering what, with all of this activity, what it's doing to the ultimate male-female relationship, and has it changed to the point? I mean, we have a problem in this country. Forget about sexual harassment for the moment. We have a problem is that the birth rate in this country is not equal to the death rate, and so that we are diminishing in population. And that's true in Europe, it's true in Asia, it's true in many places of the world. And so if we have people that are reluctant to get married, they may live together or they may not live together, they just don't want to get married, we're not generating enough children to replace those people that are dying, which means our country is shrinking. And I'm wondering if the pressure, and I think this is the right word, the sexual harassment pressure concern is so overreaching that a lot of young men are saying, screw it, I'm not going to bother with it. I'm going to drink it with my buddies and walk away from potential relationships with females. And so in that case, don't both sides actually lose?
I can't speak to the research on population growth. It's just not an area that I research. But let's talk about what you're saying in terms of the workplace again. And so a lot of men will come back and say, well, this is just making it impossible to have a normal relationship with a woman in the workplace now. I'm just too afraid of doing something wrong. You get kind of an angry pushback saying, oh, you're just screwing things up. And now I can't be normal the way I am. And that's usually pretty easy, to beat through because I always ask the question. So for example, somebody will say, well, so I put my hand on somebody's shoulder. What's the problem with that? So I touch somebody on the back. I mean, big deal. A woman on the back. Why is she upset about that? And what they're really saying is, I can't interact with you as a coworker unless I put my hands on you. And for most women, they don't want to be pawed. They don't want anybody to put their hands on them. They don't like it. And so there's no reason to do it. And I'll ask them, I say, well, the men that you paw and put your hands on, how do they react? And they'll say, well, I don't do it to men. So I'll explain, well, so you're telling me you don't actually have to put your hands on somebody to work with them. You just do it for women. Is that right? And that's what I think I just heard you say. And so the point is there's dating behavior and there's work behavior. It's not hard to separate the two, but a lot of men can't. They try to take dating-based behavior and put it back in the workplace. And so for touching, for example, in my body language book, I talk about it. There's zones of touching that we can and cannot touch each other. But I don't put my hands on a woman. In fact, I don't put my hands on a man for any reason. In business, I shake hands. I've seen a man kill a sales deal with another businessman by grabbing his hand and slapping him on the back, and you can just see the customer tense when that happens because they don't like it. And in fact, in some cultures in America, you put your hands on somebody, you get punched. You see somebody at a bar say, don't put your hands on me, and that's man to man. So I'm just saying there's social behavior, there's work behavior, and it doesn't in any way impact, I think, the relationship between a man and a woman at work, the fact that you treat everybody professionally as coworkers. You're not on a date. You're trying to get some work done. So I don't know. That's all I can really say about it, is I don't think it in any way has to impact the work environment.
I understand what you're saying. I've also read some articles recently where because of the proliferation of charges, and not all of them necessarily sustainable, but the whole level of activity, that in some corporations, senior officers have made it a policy that they will no longer meet with a woman in their office alone. That they must have somebody else.
They should be fired. They should be immediately fired.
You're going to fire the boss?
Yeah. You immediately fire somebody. That's wrong at about 5 different levels. And so you can't, that's a legal time bomb waiting to blow up.
Please tell us. That's fascinating because that just happened on Monday at a meeting I was at. You're saying that if the CEO or C-level won't meet with a woman alone, that he should be fired?
Exactly.
Am I hearing that correctly?
Yes, and here's why. Let me go through the various levels, but let's take the big one at the top. So one of the things that you can do to help yourself understand is something harassment or not is to substitute one of the other protected classes. The Civil Rights Act has these protected classes. We call it RADNADZIP, race, religion, national origin, disability, and so on. Sex is one of them, gender is one of them. In some states, gender preference, and so on and so on. So let's substitute another protected class for what that person just said. So what if the CEO said, I refuse to be in a room alone with a black person because that lying black person will falsely accuse me of sexual or of racial discrimination, or I'm going to set a policy where I refuse to be in a room with a Jewish person because that lying Jewish person is going to accuse me of religious discrimination. So how would that hold up in terms of a policy? Because sex is a protected class. So when you discriminate only against women, you are violating the Civil Rights Act. You are, in essence, violating the very thing you say you're trying to support, and you're a lawsuit waiting to happen. You're a time bomb. I can't have you working for me. So that's the first thing. Number two, it shows me that you can't logically think through a situation, because who is that third person going to be? If it's another woman, then you now have two people that you wouldn't meet with individually in the room protecting you, supposedly. So that doesn't make sense. So if it's another man, it's one of your cronies, what makes you think that that makes you any more credible and protected from that, quote, false accusation than you are now? The fact that you and your buddies say, oh, it never happened. We didn't do that. And so the logic of it, the actual how you do it, makes no sense whatsoever. So that's another thing that worries me about it. And then number three is, what are you doing with all the protected classes? You know, how is it that avoidance and running away with it is good, and what you're doing, you're destroying any sense of teamwork and camaraderie in your organization because you're saying all women are untrustworthy. That's the message I'm going to send to my entire organization, that all women are lying SOBs who are going to falsely accuse me unless they're caught at it or kept from doing it. Well, you've just alienated half your workforce, and it's called an engaged workforce. You've just disengaged half your workforce or more. How is that making you productive if that's the attitude you have about your employee, that you're all lying cheaters that I have to watch out for? So on a whole bunch of different levels, if that's my CEO, and I have counseled and coached, I've been on a board of directors of a company and counseled and coached people. I've been on the compensation committee of a CEO, board of directors. Trust me, if somebody said that, as far as I'm concerned, they just qualified themselves from the job. So that's a dumb thing to do if you're a business person.
Go ahead, Don. We're talking with Ken Cooper. Ken, how do people reach you and find your company?
Easiest way is my website, stopshnow.com. Stopshnow.com.
Okay. We've been talking with Ken Cooper of CooperCon, who's really stunned me a couple of times. I don't know about you, Dan, but it's just been a fascinating time.
I agree. We'll have him back soon.
Thank you for joining us on Recalculating. We hope the information you received on today's episode was helpful to you in starting and growing your business. Please go to our website, Recalculating.biz, to contact us, to listen to past shows, and see special offers. Until next time, remember, if you grow, we grow. Join us next week for more helpful ideas to make your business a great success. Recalculating, a program designed to help you be successful.